This episode of The Clarity Pivot is brought to you by TJB Solutions, your partner in education, creative consulting, and intentional design. Hey, family. Welcome back to The Clarity Pivot. I am your thankful host, Tavares. This is the space where I talk through the things that matter to me, the messy things, the honest things, the things we whisper about but rarely name out loud. There's no order to these pivots. It's whatever clarity life hands me in the moment. It may feel random, but the intention is steady, to grow, to heal, and to bring you along with me if you're willing to go. And while we are here, I want to name a few things clearly before we go any further. This clarity moment is presented in two parts. In this episode, part one, I talk about my own internal unraveling, the triangulation of religion, spirituality, and divine relationship, and how those lanes get tangled within me and how it gets tangled in some of us when fear, power, and control are spiritualized. Part two is where we'll talk about church hurt directly, the systems, the structures, and the wounds that follow when this confusion is left unchecked. I also want to be explicit about the lens that I'm speaking from. This episode centers Black faith, our traditions, our questions, our resistance, our imagination, and our survival. That does not mean others are excluded. It just means the starting point is honest. Black faith has always wrestled deeply with God, power, liberation, and humanity. And those truths often resonate far beyond us. And finally, I want to say this up front. This episode is not a rejection of God and spirituality. It is not an attack on church. And is not a dismissal of the many people who continue to find safety, growth, and genuine spiritual nourishment in their respective faith communities. I love and respect these people. They are my family, my friends, and my mentors, and they are thriving spiritually in their church spaces. Their experiences are real, their growth is valid, and they will not be erased from this conversation. What I am doing in this episode is telling the truth about my journey. Now, let's pivot. Disappointment is a teacher. There came a moment when I had to admit something out loud. I wasn't losing my faith. I just couldn't call this God anymore. My clarity didn't start with theology. It actually started with leadership. I watched spiritual leadership drift into something that felt less like guidance and more like control. I watched spiritual sonship and spiritual parenting turn into systems of dominance, emotional dependency, and manipulation, all baptized in religious banter. Covering became coercion, accountability became surveillance, obedience became silence. Howard Thurman, a theologian and philosopher of Black spiritual life, warned about this exact drift. When religion becomes more invested in preserving authority than nurturing the soul, it stops forming people and starts managing them. What always stopped me cold in my tracks was this. I would watch leaders whose biological children wanted nothing to do with them, but somehow they had a host of spiritual children everywhere, always close, always affirming, always available. And I remember thinking to myself, something about this is deeply off. You see, proximity is not proof of health. Loyalty is not love. And fear will keep people close long after the trust has died. But this wasn't abstract for me. In September of 2018, my life was on the brink. Depression wasn't whispering. It was heavy, constant, and consuming. I was exhausted mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. And the hardest truth I had to face was this. The place causing me the most mental anguish was church. Not God, but the place that I had spent my Sundays all of my life up to that point attending. I experienced sermons condemning identity, teachings that dismissed humanity, and a culture that demonized what it did not understand, not because it was evil, but because it challenged thought. Fear of hell echoed louder than reverence for God. Inside of that, I was suffocating. And in that moment, I made a decision that I was afraid to make, but had to. I left. Leaving wasn't rebellion. In my case, it was survival. I didn't walk away from God. I walked away from a system that was slowly convincing me that God required me to disappear just to belong. James Cone, the founder of Black liberation theology, was clear that any theology that demands the erasure of one's humanity cannot reflect the God who created that humanity in the first place. That decision saved my life. Fear is not formation. Now, I want to slow down here because this matters. This is not me saying church is inherently harmful, because it's not. I know people who are safe in their churches, people who are healing, people who are growing spiritually, emotionally, and communally. I have friends and family who are rooted in faith communities where culture, justice, and spirituality actually talk to each other. Those spaces exist. They matter. And I'm not going to ignore that truth. What I am naming is something more specific, a particular strain of Black fundamentalist theology that has done real damage. The kind that turns fear into virtue, treats questions like threats, and mistakes control for holiness. In those spaces, everything gets spiritualized in the worst way. Fraternities and sororities get labeled demonic. Identity gets labeled demonic. Culture that isn't understood gets cast as evil instead of examined. And scripture starts getting handled differently, not as wisdom to wrestle with, but as a tool to enforce whatever the leader already believes. Context gets stripped away, nuance disappears. Renita Weems, a biblical scholar who has spent her career teaching people how to actually listen to scripture, warns about this exact thing. When the Bible is pulled out of its context, it stops being a source of wisdom and becomes a means of domination. Once fear takes over, everything changes. Fear becomes the organizing principle. Fear becomes the motivator. Fear becomes the proof of faith. But fear-based evangelism isn't spiritual formation. It's psychological manipulation. Kelly Brown Douglas, a theologian who writes at the intersections of race, power, and Christian ethics, names this clearly. When fear becomes central to faith, God is no longer encountered as liberator, but as enforcer. And that shift always harms the most vulnerable first. When theology is saturated with punishment imagery, the brain does exactly what it's supposed to do. It stores those images, replays them, reinforces them. That's not revelation. That's conditioning. Fear doesn't make people fall in love with God. It makes them anxious and always questioning if God really loves them. It makes them compliant, disconnected from their own moral agency and critical thought. So let me be clear. Obedience is not the absence of questions. Faith is not bypassing the why. Peace is not pretending harm never happened. God does not need us to be less human to be more holy. God was never lost or surprised by our existence. God knew us before we were ever formed in our mother's bellies. In these toxic spaces, God was buried under fear, hierarchy, and unchecked authority. And when you finally see that, when you realize how much of what you were taught was fear wearing God's name, you can't unsee it. That's a lot to sit with. So we're going to pause here for a break. And when we come back, I want to talk about what becomes possible on the other side of that realization. how clarity reshapes the way I now understand religion, spirituality, and divine relationship without collapsing them into something that harms. If you want to stay connected with everything I'm creating, follow me on Substack, TikTok, Instagram, and Threads at Tavares Teaches. My digital business card is in the description. This episode is sponsored by TJB Solutions, supporting education, graphic design, podcasting, and professional and creative writing. If you need clarity in your brand, your school community, or your creative projects, TJB Solutions is ready to support your vision. For more information, contact us at tjbsolutions100@gmail.com. Welcome back to the Clarity Pivot. Now, let's talk about what becomes possible once we stop confusing fear with God. The 3 lanes revisited. Religion, spirituality, and divine relationship. Critical parts of my faith journey that I had somehow turned into a tangled mess of toxic faith, which hindered my growth instead of supporting it. After all I had experienced, when I decided to stop attending church services and truly deconstruct my beliefs, these 3 aspects of faith began to separate and move parallel to each other, working together rather than against each other. That's when the concept of triangulation finally made sense to me. First, religion gave me structure, and structure can be a gift when it's built to serve people, when it helps anchor us, guide us, and hold community together. There is a real beauty in rhythm, ritual, and shared belief. I don't deny that. But structure becomes dangerous when preserving the institution becomes more important than pursuing the truth. When maintaining tradition starts to matter more than the understanding. When the goal shifts from helping people grow to making sure nothing ever changes. That kind of rigidity doesn't protect faith, it suffocates it. And then, spirituality, on the other hand, is the search. It's the willingness to ask deeper questions and sit with what you don't immediately understand. It requires imagination, courage, curiosity. And Black spirituality has always lived here. From hush harbors and whispered prayers by the water to the ways we still create sacred spaces today. Our spiritual lineage has never been afraid of mystery. We've always known that God is bigger than what we were handed. And then there's divine relationship. That's the intimacy, the quiet place, the space where God meets you without titles, without manipulation, without an audience, no performance, no hierarchy, just presence, truth, and connection. It's where faith stops being something that you manage and becomes something that you live. These are not competing paths. They are parallel journeys. Thurman described faith this way, not as a single rigid track, but as an inward journey that requires structure, imagination, and intimacy to remain whole. But when they are twisted into a single tightly braided rope, power and ego rushes in to fill the gaps, only to make the braid knotty and fragile. I'm not asking anyone to choose between them. What I'm asking us to do is to stop letting any one lane dominate the others. When religion refuses accountability, spirituality becomes distorted. When spirituality refuses grounding, it becomes as unpredictable as the waves in the ocean. And when divine relationship is mediated through control, it stops being relationship at all. See, God was not lost. He was buried. And clarity came when I stopped calling dysfunction holy. Here is your call to action. Before we close, I want to invite you to do something intentional this week. Sit with what you've heard, not defensively, not urgently, but honestly. Notice what resonated. Notice what unsettled you. Notice what rises to the surface. If this episode gave language to something you've been holding quietly, share it with someone who might need that same clarity. You can join the conversation with me across all platforms at Tavares Teaches. And if you want to reflect more deeply between episodes, subscribe to my Substack. That's where I share thoughts that don't always fit into a microphone. There, you'll find exclusive insights, early and bonus episodes, and reflections that I only share with my Substack community. Also, keep an eye out for the Clarity Journal, a guided space to think, feel, and choose with intention at every pivot. This community grows because we grow together. Please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform, share it with a friend, like it, and leave a comment and share how this resonated with you. Thanks for listening. Move with intention, love with boundaries, and always choose peace as if your soul depends on it.